It is the 24th of August, 1916. Just after 5 in the evening, a wood that used to have a name nobody bothers with anymore. High wood on a French map, on a French ridge above the river Somme. What's left of it is splinters, black stumps where oak trees used to be. The summer has been hot, and the air smells of cordite and chalk dust and something sweeter that nobody talks about. In a trench called Savoy, 10 British Vickers machine guns sit on their tripods, side by side. Their water jackets are full. Their belts are loaded. Behind each gun, 2 men. Behind those 2, another 2. A whole company, 300-something soldiers, organized around 10 pieces of metal. A captain named Hutchison looks at his watch. He looks at the German line, 2,000 yards away, on a slope he can barely see through the haze of an August afternoon in France. He gives an order that on paper sounds insane. 12 hours of rapid fire, no stopping, whatever happens. At 20 to 6, the first Vickers opens up, and then the second, the third, the fourth. By the time the 10th gun joins in, the men in the trench have to shout to be heard, and most of them stop trying. They just work, belt, water, belt, water. A new barrel every 10,000 rounds, swapped out while the gun is still firing, hands raw, fingers bleeding through the rags they've wrapped around them. On the other side of no man's land, in dugouts and crater holes and forward observation posts, German soldiers are listening to a sound they have not heard before. Not exactly. They know rifle fire, they know the Maxim, their own machine gun, which is essentially the same weapon wearing a different uniform. They know artillery, and they know how artillery comes in waves. Shell, shell, shell. Then a pause, then more. This isn't waves. This doesn't pause. This is a thing without rhythm, a solid, continuous wall of bullets arcing down out of the sky like steel rain. And it does not stop at 6 o'clock, and it does not stop at midnight, and it does not stop at 3 in the morning, and it does not stop at 5. And the men in the German trenches are starting to understand something that the British, the Germans, the French, the Austrians, nobody has fully grasped until this exact night. The machines have changed the rules. The man at the gun is no longer a man. He is a node, a pair of hands on a weapon that, given water, given ammunition, given a barrel every now and then, does not get tired, does not flinch, does not lose its nerve, does not pity you. And the question the Germans are asking themselves, the question whispered in those dugouts at High Wood at 3 in the morning on the 25th of August, is the question this video is about. What is that? What kind of weapon is that? And how do we live through this if you find yourself drawn to this period? The men, the machines, the small, awful moments history almost forgot. Stay with me. There's a story tonight about a gun, but more than that, there's a story about why an entire generation of German soldiers, men who had grown up shooting deer in the Black Forest, men who had fought in colonial wars, men who were not strangers to violence, would write in their diaries that this particular British weapon was the one that broke them. Let's begin at the beginning. Not in 1916, earlier than that. To understand why German soldiers feared the Vickers, you have to understand where it came from, and you have to understand the strange fact that it was, in a sense, their own invention turned against them. The Vickers machine gun was the child of an older weapon called the Maxim. The Maxim was designed in 1884 by an American named Hiram Maxim. A man with a magnificent mustache, a long forehead, the eyes of someone who has slept badly for 40 years, and an inventor of, among other things, a better mousetrap. He had been told, half-jokingly, by a friend in Vienna in 1882, that if he really wanted to make money in Europe, he should invent something that would let those Europeans cut each other's throats with greater efficiency. He took the advice seriously. He sat down with a hand-cranked Gatling gun he'd been shown at the Philadelphia exhibition, decided that the hand-cranking was the problem, decided that the recoil of each shot already contained enough energy to load the next one, and came up with a gun that did exactly that. Press the trigger. release the trigger. In between, the gun does its own work over and over, 400, 500, 600 times a minute, and it keeps going as long as the belt has bullets in it and the barrel hasn't melted. There's a famous photograph of Hiram Maxim sitting next to his invention in a workshop in London in 1885. He looks tired. He looks rich. He looks like a man who already understood what he had made. The story goes that when he demonstrated the weapon to the British General Wolseley, the general watched the gun fire a long burst into a paper target, said nothing for a long moment, and then asked Maxim quietly what the rate of fire was. Maxim told him. The general nodded. He did not look pleased. He looked like a man being shown the future of his profession and not enjoying the view. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like it. Most armies didn't know what to do with it. The British used Maxims in colonial expeditions, most famously at Omdurman in the Sudan in September 1898, where a Sudanese force of around 50,000 men charged a British square armed with around 20 Maxims. The battle lasted a few hours. The British lost 48 men. The Sudanese lost something between 10 and 15,000. A young Winston Churchill, then a junior officer, watched the action from horseback and described it afterwards in language that he tried, you can feel him trying, to make sound like normal Victorian military prose. The trying does not quite work. The Maxims, he wrote, did not so much shoot the enemy as scythe them, as a man might scythe long grass on a summer morning. It is the kind of sentence that sits on the page and refuses to be polite. The Germans bought Maxims too. They put them in production at Spandau, near Berlin, and gave them the name Maschinengewehr 08, MG08. By 1914, the German army had thousands of them, distributed in companies of 6 guns to most infantry regiments. The French were slower to embrace the machine gun. They preferred the Hotchkiss, an air-cooled design with metal feed strips rather than fabric belts. The Austrians had the Schwarzlos. Everyone by 1914 had a machine gun. The shape of the war that was about to begin was hidden inside those workshops, in pieces, waiting to be assembled. And the British. By 1914, the British had something else, something they had been quietly working on for over a decade. The company Vickers had bought out the Maxim firm back in 1896. Their engineers had spent years simplifying the original design, replacing weak components with stronger alloys, flipping the toggle action upside down so the body of the gun could be smaller and lighter. The result was officially adopted by the British Army on the 26th of November, 1912. They called it the Vickers machine gun, Mark I. And on paper, it didn't look revolutionary. On paper, it was just a modernized Maxim. Lighter water jacket, cleaner internal action, same. .303 ammunition the Lee Enfield rifle fired, but anyone who actually fired it noticed something straight away. It just worked. It worked in mud. It worked in rain. It worked when other guns jammed. It worked when the man firing it was so exhausted he couldn't remember his own name. It worked when there was sand in the action and grease frozen in the joints. And it worked when the barrel was so hot the water in the cooling jacket was boiling and spitting steam through the condenser hose. There were stories that circulated in the British Army in the early years of the war that took on the texture of legend. A Vickers buried in the mud of the salient at Ypres in 1915, dug up 2 weeks later, hosed off, and brought back into action without so much as a barrel change. A Vickers that had taken a piece of shrapnel through the receiver, a piece big enough to dent the metal visibly, and had kept firing for the rest of the engagement. A Vickers that had been the only thing standing between a German night raid and a sleeping British company in Flanders, manned by a single corporal whose name nobody bothered to record, firing alone for 40 minutes in pitch darkness by the light of his own muzzle flash. The stories were probably half true. They were also, in a way, the way soldiers talk about a weapon they trust. You don't tell stories like that about a rifle. You don't tell them about a pistol. You tell them about something you have come to feel on some level is on your side. There was a phrase that went around the British Machine Gun Corps, the unit eventually formed to handle these weapons. They called the Vickers the Queen of the Battlefield. And like a lot of soldier nicknames, it sounds slightly silly on the page until you understand what the men meant. They didn't mean a beautiful thing. They meant a thing that ruled, a thing that, once it was set up properly with enough water and enough ammunition, decided who lived and who didn't on whichever piece of ground it was watching. The Machine Gun Corps itself was a strange institution, born out of necessity. At the beginning of the war, each British infantry battalion had been allocated 2 machine guns, 2, for around 1,000 men. By the autumn of 1915, after the first year of fighting in France and Flanders, the British High Command had begun to grasp that 2 machine guns per battalion was a figure from another century. The Germans, in many sectors, had 10 or 12 guns covering the same frontage. The French had begun to mass their Hotchkiss guns in dedicated companies. The British, slowly, late, but finally, did the same. In October 1915, the Machine Gun Corps was formed as a separate body, with its own training, its own depots, its own doctrine, its own cap badge. 2 crossed Vickers guns over a crown. The men who wore that badge had volunteered for it, or been transferred to it from their parent regiments, and they came from every corner of the British Isles and the wider empire. Welsh miners, London clerks, Scottish farm hands, sons of Indian railway workers. They were trained, often hurriedly, at depots in Grantham and elsewhere, drilled on the mechanism of the gun until they could strip and reassemble it blindfold, and then sent forward to the front to do the work nobody else wanted to do. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a temptation, when you talk about a weapon like this, to make it sound thrilling, to turn it into the hero of the story. It isn't. The Vickers killed thousands of men, most of them young, most of them frightened, most of them no different in their basic humanity than the British boys feeding the belts. German soldiers who walked into the arc of its fire were sons and fathers and brothers. And the families that got the telegrams in Hanover and Bavaria and the small towns of East Prussia wept the same way the families in Yorkshire and London wept when the telegrams arrived from the Somme. This is the story of a machine, and it is also the story of what that machine did to the men on both sides of it. The British boys feeding it hour after hour, hands ruined, ears bleeding from the noise, learning a kind of trade nobody had ever taught before, and the German boys it was aimed at, learning a kind of fear nobody had ever taught either. Both groups, in a strange way, were the first generation of an experiment. The experiment was simple. What happens to human bodies and human minds when industrial precision arrives on the battlefield? The answer was being written in real time, in chalk and mud and blood, all along a line that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Let's go back to the gun itself for a moment, because the dark reason German soldiers feared it isn't just about what it did, it's about how it did it. The engineering is the horror, if you really stop and think about it. A Vickers, fully loaded, fully equipped, with its tripod and its traversing mechanism, weighs around 50 pounds. That's heavier than most men want to carry across a muddy field. But once it's in position, that weight is the point. That weight is what keeps the barrel steady. That weight is what lets a trained crew lay a continuous, predictable beaten zone of bullets on a fixed area of ground, hour after hour, with the same accuracy at the end of the night as at the beginning. The water jacket is what kept the gun alive. A heavy machine gun fires so fast that the barrel, in any other design, would simply heat itself to the point of warping or melting, or cooking the propellant in the chamber and detonating a round before the bolt was closed. The Maxim solved this problem with water. The Vickers inherited the solution and improved it. 1 gallon of water around the barrel. A rubber hose leading from the top of the jacket to a steel container The crew called the condenser. As the gun fires, the water boils. The steam goes through the hose, hits the cool air inside the condenser, turns back into water, and is poured back into the jacket. Closed loop, almost. Imagine the trench at night. The gun has been firing for an hour, 2 hours. The water jacket is so hot you can't touch it with bare skin. The condenser, 6 feet away, is bubbling like a kettle on a stove. The air around the position smells of hot metal and burnt cordite, and there's a fine gray haze of smoke that the men breathe in until their lungs ache, and their voices, when they try to speak, come out raw and broken. The gunner has a piece of rag wrapped around each hand because the firing handle gets hot enough to burn. The number 2, the man feeding the belt, has his eyes fixed on the cartridges as they feed through, watching for a jam, watching for a torn link, watching for the moment the belt runs out and a new one has to be threaded in without losing the rhythm. The number 3 is at the condenser, checking the water level, occasionally pouring fresh water in from a petrol tin. Behind them, 2 more men are filling belts by hand from a hopper, working the lever of the belt-filling machine, 250 rounds at a time, over and over, until their forearms cramp. That is a single gun. That is one position. Now multiply by 10. Then look out across no man's land, in the dark, and try to imagine what the air over the German lines looks like when 10 of these positions are all firing at once, all at the same patch of ground, all calibrated to drop their bullets on the same square of chalk and earth 2,000 yards away. It is not a metaphor when the German diarists describe it as rain. It is the closest word in any language to what it actually was. The almost matters, because in the heat of a long action, the men ran out of water faster than the condenser could keep up. Crews carried petrol tins of it, water bottles, anything that could hold liquid. There is a quiet, slightly grim, slightly funny fact buried in the records of the machine gun corps. When the water ran low and there was no time to fetch more, the gunners used what they had. They urinated into the gun. The men joked about it afterwards. They mentioned it in letters home. But on the night of the 24th of August, 1916, at High Wood, after the company's water bottles were empty, that is what they did. The official account survives. Quote, at least 4 petrol tins of water besides all the water bottles of the company and the urine tins from the neighboring units. End quote. They kept the gun going however they had to. Now think about that for a second. Think about that from the German side. You are in a dugout. You have been listening to British fire for 6 hours, then 8, then 10. You think, surely, surely, surely they have to stop. Their guns must overheat. Their men must drop. Their ammunition must run out. The night must protect us at some point. And the night doesn't. The fire just continues. Because 2,000 yards away in a trench called Savoy, a man named Private Robert Shaw and a man named Bartlett have spent 12 straight hours feeding cloth belts into a machine that fills them with cartridges. And another set of men have spent 12 straight hours carrying those belts forward, and another set have spent 12 straight hours pouring water, and yes, urine, into a steel jacket, so that one gun, Sergeant Dean's gun, can fire 120,000 rounds before the dawn comes. One gun, 120,000 rounds, from a single position, in a single night. That's a number that doesn't mean anything until you put it next to another number. A trained rifleman in 1916 could fire 15 aimed rounds a minute. 15. The Vickers, in its sustained barrage mode, was firing the equivalent of 170 riflemen, all aiming at the same patch of ground, all with the same precision, all without needing to breathe. That's the dark reason. That's it, right there. The Vickers wasn't terrifying because it was loud, or because it killed more men per minute than other guns. Although it did, it was terrifying, because it didn't get tired, it didn't get scared, it didn't lose interest, it didn't go home. A German soldier knew instinctively what a tired enemy looked like. He had been a tired enemy himself. He knew that men charge and then men slow, that men attack and then men retreat, that men do things and then men stop. The Vickers, properly fed, did not stop. There was no moment of weakness to wait for. I want to pause here for a moment. If you're enjoying this, if this is the kind of history you want to spend your evenings with, the small, specific, true things rather than the grand, sweeping summaries, it helps me if you tap the subscribe button. No pressure. I make these because I think this period matters, and because the men on both sides deserve to be remembered as men. Not as numbers, not as colors on a map. Men, with names like Robert Shaw, like Dean, like the German soldiers we'll meet in a minute, whose names also survive in the archives, written in their own hands. Right. Back to it. Let's go to the night of High Wood properly, not the summary. The night itself. High Wood in the summer of 1916 was a small patch of trees on the ridge between the villages of Bazentin and Longueval, north of the river Somme. Before the war, it had been a piece of agricultural Picardy, walnut trees, oaks, a path that local farmers used to bring cattle up the slope. By August, it was something else. The British had attacked it on the 14th of July, briefly held it, withdrawn the next day. The Germans had reinforced it. The British had attacked again, and again. The wood had become a strange green-black smudge on a tan ridge, a place where every attack failed and every attack cost. By the third week of August, British commanders had a problem. They were planning a fresh assault on the Flers Ridge and on High Wood itself. They wanted artillery support. But the geometry of the ground meant that any artillery barrage strong enough to suppress the German defenses would also fall on the British infantry advancing across no man's land. The shells couldn't be aimed precisely enough. The risk of hitting their own men was too great. So somebody had an idea. A young captain in the 100th Machine Gun Company, Graham Seton-Hutchison, proposed using his 10 Vickers guns to do what artillery normally did, lay down a long-range, indirect fire barrage, not at men they could see, at men they couldn't. The technique was new. The Canadians had been experimenting with it. The Germans, on their side, were experimenting with it too. The idea was to angle the guns upward, calculate the trajectory like an artillery piece, and let gravity carry the bullets down onto German communication trenches and reinforcement routes 2,000 yards back from the front line. If it worked, the British infantry could attack without their own artillery killing them, and the Germans wouldn't be able to send reinforcements forward because the air over their reserve trenches would be full of falling steel. It had never been done at this scale before. Captain Hutchison ordered something nobody had ever ordered, in writing, in the history of the British Army. Continuous rapid fire, for 12 hours, from 10 guns. He didn't know if it would work. Nobody did. But High Wood had eaten so many battalions by that point that the British were prepared to try almost anything. On the night of the 23rd of August and the morning of the 24th, 2 companies of infantry were borrowed from their own duties and assigned to one task, carrying ammunition forward to the Savoy Trench. They carried boxes, and more boxes, and more boxes. They carried belts, fabric belts, 250 rounds each, stacked in wooden crates. They carried petrol cans of water. They carried spare barrels, 50 of them, packed in grease. By 5 in the evening on the 24th, the trench had become something between a fortress and a factory floor. 10 Vickers guns spaced along its length, belt-filling machines worked by Robert Shaw and Bartlett, stacks of ammunition, the smell of oil and sweat, and the chalk dust that hung over everything on the Somme that summer. At 5:45, 7 of the guns opened fire. For about 40 minutes, the gunners thought their fire was falling short. They paused. Hutchison ordered them to resume. At 6:40 in the evening, the guns started again, and this time they did not stop until just after 6 in the morning. 11 hours and 20 minutes of continuous machine gun fire. Some sources round it to 12. Some historians, going back to the war diaries, have argued the higher figures for total rounds are likely exaggerated. The most careful modern research suggests the real number was probably less than the legendary million, but still extraordinary by any standard. Hundreds of thousands of rounds, possibly more, from a single company, on a single piece of ground, in a single night. What is harder to convey in a number is what the night actually felt like inside that trench. The men did not know they were making history. They did not know that 100 years later, researchers would still be arguing about the precise figures in their war diary. They were just trying to do their job. They had been ordered to fire continuously for 12 hours, and they were going to fire continuously for 12 hours, and that was that. Around 8 in the evening, somebody decided that the rate of fire was burning the barrels out faster than the supply could sustain. The order went down the line, gun by gun. Slow it down. Keep firing, but slow it down. 200 rounds a minute instead of 400. Make the ammunition last. Make the water last. Make the men last. By midnight, the original supply of water was running low. Men were sent back along the communication trenches with empty petrol tins to find more. They came back. They went out again. They came back again. Around 2 in the morning, an officer made the call that has gone down in the records, the call about urine, and the gunners shrugged and did what they had to do. Around 4 in the morning, the men working the belt-filling machines could no longer feel their fingers. They kept working anyway. Around 5, a few of them began to fall asleep at their work, hands still moving, brains shutting down in shifts, the way you sometimes see a sleeping horse keep walking forward. Captain Hutchison wrote about it after the war. His account, dry, technical, almost embarrassed about the achievement, is one of the strangest documents to come out of the Somme. He noted in passing that the prize of 5 francs offered to the best gun crew had been won by Sergeant P. Dean, holder of the Distinguished Conduct Medal, whose team had fired just over 120,000 rounds. He noted that many of the gunners were found at the end of the action asleep at their posts from sheer exhaustion. He noted that the barrels had been swapped out continuously throughout the night, that the belts had been filled by hand without stopping, that water had been brought from every available source. What he didn't write much about was what was happening at the other end. That part of the story has to come from the Germans. A captured German officer, interrogated at divisional headquarters after the attack, described what he had experienced as, in the original report, annihilating. That's the word that survives. Annihilating. The German counterattacks, which had been planned to retake the lost ground at dawn, were broken up before they could even concentrate. The reserve battalions trying to move forward through the communication trenches behind High Wood found those trenches under a continuous arc of falling bullets, and the men in them simply could not move. They couldn't run forward. They couldn't run back. They lay in the chalk, faces pressed to the ground, while above them the air sang with a sound that one German diarist described as the noise of 1,000,000 bees with iron stings. There were other testimonies from other sectors that night and over the months that followed. A German officer named Ernst Junger, who would later write a famous memoir about his time on the Western Front, described the British machine gun fire he experienced in 1916 and 17 as something that turned a familiar landscape into a foreign country. Trees you had walked under in the morning were splinters by the afternoon. Trenches you had walked through were unrecognizable. The air over the ground at night had the quality, he said, of a slow tide, rising and falling, never quite still, always carrying something with it that you did not want it to carry. He was not specifically writing about the Vickers. He was writing about the experience of being on the receiving end of British industrial firepower, and the Vickers was a central part of that experience. A regimental history from a Bavarian unit published in the early 1920s, recorded a more specific account. A company of Bavarian infantry, attempting to move up into a forward position somewhere near Bapaume in the autumn of 1916, was caught in the open by what the survivors described as an arc of fire coming from a direction nobody had expected. There was no obvious British machine gun position in line of sight. The bullets were coming down out of the sky, almost vertically, as if dropped from a great height. The men dove into shell holes and crater puddles. They stayed there for hours. When they finally crawled back to their own lines after dark, they reported that the British, the Verfluchten Engländer, had a new way of using their machine guns, and that this new way was something the German army needed to understand quickly, because the old assumptions about machine gun fire had stopped being true. There's a passage from a German officer named Stephen Westman, who served on the Somme that summer. That gives a sense of what the German experience of British fire was like that year. He wrote about the heavy bombardments, the broken dugouts, the comrades dug out of collapsed shelters, sometimes alive, sometimes not. He wrote about how the rats became hysterical, fleeing into the German dugouts to escape the shelling. He wrote about soldiers who became hysterical too, who tried to run out of the bunkers into the open and had to be held back by their friends. He described the British fire from the German side as a kind of veil of sequins over the ground, flashing and flashing and flashing, each flash a gun. That was the artillery. That was just the artillery. Add to it in late August a new sound, a sound that did not come in waves like shell fire, a sound that did not pulse, a sound that simply went on, hour after hour, and got into men's heads and would not leave. A German account from another sector of the Western Front, preserved in regimental histories, put it like this: as long as the machine guns and their crews are intact, every English attack is bound to be beaten back. The Germans said it about their own machine guns defending against British attacks. By August 1916, they were learning to say something similar about the British machine guns. As long as their machine guns are firing, our counterattacks cannot form. You see the symmetry. Both sides were learning the same lesson from opposite ends of the same weapons. The lesson was that the human attack, the mass of men running forward with rifles and bayonets, the kind of attack armies had relied on for 1,000 years, was over. Done. Replaced. By the machine. By the cone of fire. By the beaten zone. By a number on a calculation card. It is one of the saddest realizations of the entire war. The men understood it before the generals did. They understood it in their bodies, in the trenches, while the generals were still drawing arrows on maps. There is a detail about the night of High Wood that I want to give you, because it stuck with me, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't make it into most accounts. Captain Hutchison, in his quiet, technical voice, mentioned that the gun crews developed a strange relationship with their weapons over those 12 hours. They began to think of them, he said, almost as living things, as if the Vickers were tired, as if they needed rest, as if they could feel pain in their barrels and exhaustion in their actions. By 3 or 4 in the morning, a man would lean against his gun the way you might lean against a horse you had ridden too hard, and pat it, and whisper to it, and pour water into its jacket the way you'd give water to a dying animal. I don't know what to do with that detail. I keep thinking about it. There is something about the moment when men start talking to machines the way they used to talk to animals. Something that says, here, right here in this trench in 1916, a line is being crossed that will never be uncrossed. The relationship between the human and the made thing has shifted. The made thing is now alive enough to be worthy of pity, and the made thing, on the other side of no man's land, is now alive enough to be worthy of terror. Sergeant P. Dean, DCM. That's the only record of him most people will ever see. A surname, an initial, a medal, a footnote in Captain Hutchison's account, naming him as the man whose gun fired more rounds than any other that night. The records don't tell us much else. The DCM, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, was awarded for gallantry in action, second only to the Victoria Cross. Deane had earned it at some point earlier, maybe at Lewes in 1915, maybe somewhere else. The Machine Gun Corps was an unusual unit in the British Army. It was formed in October 1915 specifically to handle the new weapons, and it drew its men from across-the-line regiments. A boy who had volunteered to be a rifleman in a PALS battalion in 1914 might find himself 2 years later sitting behind a Vickers in a chalk trench, doing a job nobody had imagined when he signed up. The Machine Gun Corps would, by the end of the war, have suffered casualties out of all proportion to its size. The men called themselves, with the dark humor of soldiers everywhere, the Suicide Club. The reasoning was simple. A Vickers position was the first thing any attacking force tried to silence. A Vickers position drew artillery fire. A Vickers position was the priority target of any raiding party, any sniper, any incoming barrage. To serve a Vickers was to make yourself the most important and most targeted man on your stretch of front. And yet, men like Sergeant Deane served them for 12 hours, without stopping. I think about him sometimes. I don't know what he looked like. I don't know what he sounded like. I don't know what county he came from. But I know that on the night of the 24th of August, 1916, with his hands so cramped he couldn't unclench them, with his ears so battered by the noise of his own gun that he would carry the deafness for years, he kept firing, because that was his job, and because the alternative was that the British infantry attacking High Wood would walk into a German counterattack with no covering fire and would die in greater numbers than they were already dying. There is no statue of Sergeant Deane, no road named after him. He won the prize of 5 francs. The fear that German soldiers felt for the Vickers was not, in the end, a fear of a single weapon on a single night. It was a fear of what the weapon represented, and by 1917 and 1918, that fear had hardened into a kind of professional respect, the way veterans on both sides came to respect the things that had hurt them most. In 1917, at Messines, at Passchendaele, at Cambrai, the Vickers was used in barrage roles increasingly similar to what had been pioneered at High Wood. The Canadians, in particular, became masters of indirect machine gun fire. Their gun crews would plot targets on maps the way artillery officers plotted them, fire at coordinates they could not see, and adjust their aim based on observer reports from forward positions. By Passchendaele, in the autumn of 1917, the British and Canadian machine gun barrages were a routine part of every major operation. The Germans adapted. They built deeper dugouts. They reinforced their reserve positions. They scattered their reinforcements over wider areas to reduce the casualties from any single barrage. But the basic problem, the problem that the British, with their endless industrial capacity, could simply produce more bullets and more belts and more guns than the Germans could absorb, was a problem the Germans never fully solved. It is worth noting briefly that the Vickers was not only a trench weapon. By the middle of the war, an air-cooled version of the gun had been adapted for use in aircraft. The Royal Flying Corps mounted Vickers guns on a long list of fighter aircraft, from the Sopwith triplane to the Sopwith Camel to the SE-5. With the development of synchronization gear, the gun could fire through the spinning propeller without striking the blades, a piece of engineering that sounds absurd until you stop and think about it. A bullet leaving the muzzle of a Vickers at over 2,000 feet per second. Time to pass through a gap between propeller blades rotating at over 1,000 revolutions per minute. The mathematics of it is the kind of thing that should give anyone a quiet moment of awe or unease, probably both. The German pilots, in their Fokkers and Albatrosses, faced British and French aircraft armed with the same essential weapon that was tormenting their friends in the trenches. The Vickers, in the air, was sometimes called the silenced gun because the noise of the engine drowned it out from the pilot's perspective. He pressed a button on the control column and watched the tracer rounds reach across the sky toward another machine. He did not hear the gunfire. He only saw the result. On other fronts, the Vickers traveled with the British Army wherever it went. In Mesopotamia, in the heat of the Iraqi summer, where the water in the cooling jackets sometimes evaporated faster than the condenser could recover it. In Palestine, where the dust got into the action and the men had to clean their guns more often than they cleaned themselves. In Gallipoli, in 1915, where Vickers' guns supported the Australian and New Zealand troops on the cliffs above the beaches, firing across narrow gullies at Turkish positions a few hundred yards away. The gun went everywhere. The Empire's wars were its wars. The wars were its life. By 1918, when the German army launched its Great Spring Offensive, the role of the Vickers had become almost mythical in its consistency. German stormtroopers, the elite units leading the spring attacks, were trained specifically to identify and bypass British machine gun nests, rather than assault them frontally. They knew by then that a frontal assault on a properly sighted Vickers in a prepared position was a sentence, not a tactic. They went around. They infiltrated. They tried to take the guns from the flank from behind with grenades, with flamethrowers, with anything except a line of men walking forward. The lesson had been learned. The full cost of learning it cannot be calculated. The cemeteries along the old front lines hold the cost. The white headstones with the German names face the white headstones with the British names, and the French and the Australian, and the Canadian and the South African, and the Indian. The men who learned the lesson are mostly the men who paid for it. When the war ended in November 1918, the Vickers continued. It served in the British Army for another 50 years. It saw action in the Second World War, in Korea, in Malaya, in Aden. It was finally retired in the early 1960s, replaced by a Belgian-designed weapon called the FN Mag. By then, the men who had fed its belts at high wood, the few who had survived not just the war, but the long years afterwards, were old. Some of them gave interviews. Some of them wrote memoirs. Most of them said very little about what they had done when pressed, when asked specifically about a particular night, a particular action. The survivors of the Machine Gun Corps tended to talk about the gun the way you might talk about an old colleague, with respect, with a certain weariness, with the understanding that the gun had done a job and they had helped it do that job, and the job had been necessary, and the job had been terrible, and both of those things could be true at the same time. One veteran interviewed in the 1960s was asked about the noise, about the famous, the continuous, the unforgettable noise of sustained Vickers fire. He thought about it for a long time. He was an old man by then. He had been a young man at the Somme. He had seen and done things that he had spent 40 years not talking about. He said eventually that the noise wasn't the part he remembered. The noise was actually. After a while it stopped being noise. It became a kind of absence, a wall of sound so total that everything else, the shouts, the orders, the rifle fire, the artillery, simply disappeared into it. There was no noise. There was just the Vickers, which was the world. The part he remembered, he said, was the smell of hot oil, the smell of cordite, the smell of the wet Hessian sandbags around the gun position, drying in the heat coming off the barrel, and, towards dawn, after 12 hours of continuous firing, the smell of the men, sweat, exhaustion. A particular smell, he said, that you only got from men who had not slept, and had not eaten, and had not stopped working for half a day, men whose bodies had been pushed past the point of language and into something more basic, more animal, more honest. That was what he remembered. Not the noise, the smell. I think that's the thing I want to leave you with. Because when we talk about the dark reason German soldiers feared the British Vickers, we tend to imagine the German point of view, the man in the dugout, The reserve battalion trying to move up, the counterattack that failed to form. And those are the right images. They tell the truth. But the dark reason was darker than that. The dark reason was that the gun was a glimpse, in 1916, of something that nobody on either side fully understood yet. A glimpse of a future in which men and machines work together so closely that the men begin to think of the machines as alive. A glimpse of a future in which the weapon does not get tired, but the men feeding the weapon do, and they keep feeding it anyway, because that is the only way to win the kind of war the new century has invented. A glimpse of a future in which the question is no longer how brave you are, or how skilled, or how lucky. The question is how much ammunition is on your side of the line, and how much water, and how many spare barrels, and how many hands willing to feed the belts at 3 in the morning when everyone else is asleep. The Germans feared the Vickers because the Vickers was, in a sense, the future arriving early. They didn't have the words for it then. We barely have the words for it now. But every soldier in every dugout listening to the sound of a sustained Vickers barrage in 1916 understood, at some level below language, that the war they thought they were fighting was over, and a different war had begun. A war fought between industries as much as armies. A war in which courage still mattered, but no longer mattered enough. That, I think, is the dark reason, not just that the gun killed men, many guns killed men, but that this particular gun, with its absurd reliability and its boiling water and its hand-filled belts, and its crews talking to it like a horse, was the first weapon that whispered the new century into the ears of the men who would have to live in it. Some of them did live in it. Most of them didn't. The cemeteries on the Somme, the German ones and the British ones, are full of the men who didn't. And on quiet days, if you walk those rows of headstones and read the names, you can almost hear the sound that the survivor talked about. The sound that wasn't noise anymore, the sound that was the world. Captain Hutchison wrote, at the end of his account of High Wood, that the operation had been a brilliant success, that the objectives had been taken within a short time, that the counterattacks had been broken up, that the German prisoners had used the word annihilating to describe what they had experienced. And then he wrote one more thing, almost as an afterthought. He wrote that at the end of the 12 hours, many of the NCOs and gunners were found asleep at their posts. I think about that line a lot. The men who had served the gun all night, who had fed it and watered it and swapped its barrels and poured their own urine into it to keep it firing, slept where they had stood. Their gun, finally silent. The Germans 2,000 yards away, also silent. The British infantry secured on its new ground, also silent. For a moment, just before dawn, on the 25th of August 1916, after 12 hours of sound that was no longer sound, there was a silence over High Wood that men on both sides must have remembered for the rest of their lives. Then somebody coughed, somebody else stretched. A bird, maybe, called from one of the broken oak stumps. The day began. And the war, the new war, the industrial war, the war we are still in some ways living inside, continued without them. If this is the kind of story you want to spend more evenings with, the small, specific, true ones, subscribe and stay close. There are more nights like this one on more ridges, in more woods, with more names that history almost forgot. I'd like to keep telling them. The men on both sides earned the telling. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember the ones who didn't come home.